Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're getting near the end of the season here. Just a few more things to do. This is our second of two lectures at the Muscarelle this spring in our annual spring series, Selected Topics in Architecture. But as many of you who have been keeping score know, we've sort of melded it together with our deep dive exploration on Degas. We do have one more event, aside from tonight, left in our Degas exploration this spring, and that is next week. Professor Charles Palermo will join me. We'll do it via Zoom, and we'll do a book club on the exhibition catalog, Picasso Looks at Degas. So I hope all of you can join us and invite your friends. It'll be an easy lift because you can actually do it from your living room and have a glass of wine while you're listening in or partially listening in or whatever you want to do. So let's get to tonight's topic. And it's a fun topic. It's a rich topic. It could be a sequence of 3-credit courses exploring the topic from different angles. But of course, it's speaking French, the influence of the École des Beaux-Arts on the late 19th and early 20th century American architecture scene. One of my professors at Columbia once asked the question to our small seminar class on Italian Renaissance architecture, and his question was, where can you find the greatest concentration of Italian Renaissance architecture? And so we're all struggling to think what city he could be referring to. Is it Rome? Is it Florence? Is it Bologna, Mantua, Vicenza, maybe even Milan? But with all of our ideas and suggestions firmly rejected, he went on to say that where you can find the greatest concentration of Italian Renaissance architecture is right here in the United States. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And I don't think that probably escapes any of you who have traveled around to more than one city, and I know many of you have been to many cities in America, and you see these buildings everywhere. And that's what we're going to explore tonight, a little bit of the why you see them everywhere. The driving force behind the American treasure trove of classical style buildings really was the presence of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris on the American architectural scene in the late 19th and early 20th century. American students interested in the study of architecture started making their way to Paris. There weren't many avenues for a formal architectural education here in the United States, and they start making their way to Paris and studying and enrolling at the École des Beaux-Arts. So we're going to take a glimpse into the vast pool of monumentally styled buildings designed by Americans who studied at the École. But our focus is going to be on a few specific individuals and partnerships. We're going to look at Richard Morris Hunt. He was the first. Charles McKim, and of course his firm McKim, Mead & White. John Carrera and Thomas Hastings of Carrera and Hastings. Delano and Aldrich, and John Russell Pope, and we'll touch on a few others along the way. So what is the École des Beaux-Arts? Well, translated directly, for those of you with a knowledge of French, you know this, it's the School of Fine Arts, but it refers to a number of very important art schools in Paris and around France. Through its very long life, which dates back to 1648, long before the French Revolution, by the way, so this is in the age of the monarchy, the school has taught drawing, painting, sculpture, engraving, architecture, and other of the allied arts. The focus, and this is what's important of the school, from its earliest days, was on classical arts and architecture from the Roman Empire and ancient Greece. And that filtered through everything that was done there. As architecture evolved in the 19th century, so did the teaching at the École. And from the middle of the 19th century until about the turn of the 20th century, the Beaux-Arts architectural style that was taught reflected what I think you can refer to as a composite curriculum. It focused, of course, on the principles of French neoclassicism, but it also incorporated elements from the Italian Renaissance, from the broader Baroque, and increasingly, and this is where the power came from, relied on modern materials such as iron and glass. A really critical part of the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts was that you would apprentice with a practicing architect who was affiliated with the school. You would join his, and it was always a him, his atelier, and you could practice what you were taught in your classes and be guided by an experienced mentor as you developed your skills. Really, that Beaux-Arts architecture would catch on in America is not as surprising as it may seem. Some of the earliest governmental buildings in the New Republic and even dating to colonial times look to Greek architecture. And so many of the earliest larger, more important buildings in the United States were in the Greek Revival architectural style. And quite frankly, the US Capitol building right there in Washington was a beacon shining across the young country from its very earliest days. So people had the ability to look toward the US Capitol. But it wasn't permeating and present everywhere until some things started to happen. So as I mentioned, formal architectural training didn't exist in 19th century America. American architects generally learned their skills. They decided they wanted to be an architect. Maybe they were a good draftsman. Maybe they studied some engineering, but had a little bit more interest in the artistic side of engineering. And what they would do is they would join with a partnership as an apprentice, an architectural partnership, and learn their design skills through what was taught by the principals. So after spending his adolescence in Europe, his father had passed away early, and his mother had taken him and his family to Europe and immersed them, quite frankly, in the arts. Richard Morris Hunt became the first American student to be admitted to the architectural section at the École des Beaux-Arts. He was there for a while, a longer tenure than most students spend at the École. He spent the years 1846 to 1854. 1954 would have been a really long time. And during that time, the École was in a long-running conversation, just sort of contrasting and comparing Neo-Grec, you might almost call it Greek Revival, and rationalist Gothic doctrines against the discipline of the French-Italian academic tradition. And one of the key features of the École des Beaux-Arts is the Prix de Rome, given in a number of sections, a number of the arts sections at the École, where a student would win and then go and study in Rome for a few years. At the École, Hunt learned everything there was to be learned. He learned to design quickly, he learned to design monumentally, and the experience that he gained in Paris at the institution made him one of the most valuable architects when he returned back to the United States, because he had this alternative perspective. He hadn't just learned from an architectural office in the United States, he had learned from a world-renowned architectural school. He also had worked with a great architect in his atelier in Paris. He worked with Hector Lafeuille, and Lafeuille was given very many of the jobs of the remaking of the Louvre as that building changed its programming following the French Revolution, following it becoming a museum, following it sort of merging together some of the academies that were there. He learned a lot, Richard Morris Hunt did, as an apprentice with Lafeuille. So at 27, Hunt returns to the United States and settles in New York City in September 1855 with the goal of bringing American building design into line with the best of that of Europe. And he pretty quickly began receiving commissions. Really interesting early job was a commission he got from the Johnston brothers in New York. And the Johnsons had a really interesting idea, and it was new. This hadn't been done before. They wanted to build a building where artists could have studios and potentially also live as a community among each other. There was a communal space for exhibiting art, and I forget the number of studios, but it was a number of studios, 25, and a lot of great things about this building, and I think you can see it in the picture. Really large windows that let in a lot of light into the artists' apartments and the studios. Big spaces. It was the first building of its kind in New York City. We all know about all of the studio buildings and studio areas that came after this, but this was the first one. And that plan has been replicated by many other cities in the United States since then. Well, Hunt was so pleased, and I apologize for this picture, and it's impossible to find this photograph in good form. Even when it's published, it's terrible. But Hunt was so pleased with his design that he himself became one of the tenants and took a new approach. He decided to set up an École-inspired atelier in the building. He filled it with impressive art and a book collection which he had amassed while living and training in Europe. And that book collection had everything about art and everything about architecture. It was said to be one of the most comprehensive libraries on the subject of architecture in the United States at that time. And he invited students in to work with him. So a little bit different than apprenticing at a typical architect's workshop. But some of his earliest students, and he only operated this atelier for 3 years, but he had the ability and the opportunity to train some of the people who would become bright luminaries in the field of architecture. William Ware would be one of his students, Henry Van Brunt, George Post, Frank Furness, even some artists. William Merritt Chase came and studied under Hunt at his atelier. These students would not only preach what they learned from Hunt at his atelier, and he was espousing all of the things and procedures and practices he had learned at the École des Beaux-Arts, but they would, in addition to creating their own buildings and monuments, some of these people would also have an impact on the development of architectural education in America. And I think in those two ways, Hunt had a foundational impact on directing the turn of American architecture right there in the latter part of the 19th century. Some of Hunt's biggest impact comes through his student, William Ware. Ware is a few years after graduating out of Hunt's atelier. He is asked to lead the first American School of Architecture at MIT when it was founded in 1868. And he built that program into a rigorous École des Beaux-Arts style of training. And then he later went on to head, at its outset, Columbia University's School of Architecture when it was founded a few years later. A lot of architects that follow these gentlemen are going to be educated at MIT and Columbia. A lot of the architects that we know about from the late 19th and early 20th century spent time studying at those two places. So what does Hunt's work look like? His work touched on many chords. You wouldn't call him a strict classicist like Charles McKim was, but we're going to focus a bit on some of his more classical endeavors. When the gift of the Statue of Liberty was announced, obviously there was a place needed to plant that statue, and Hunt was selected to design the base upon which Lady Liberty would stand. And he knew what was coming. He had been there, he had experienced Europe, he knew Paris, he knew the styles. Gustave Eiffel is engaged in this enterprise as providing some of the structural supports. Hunt is the perfect choice for the job. He understands the monumentality and what was required for an enormous work of art. And I think you can see a great amount of classical styling in what I'm showing you here. Hunt also became a favorite architect of the Gilded Age in America. He was hired by many of the wealthiest people, and this is a summer cottage he built in Newport, Rhode Island for William Vanderbilt. What's interesting as we work through the presentation tonight, and we'll go through a lot of buildings that are really interesting and classical in their styling. I'm not sure the treasure trove would be as deep if it weren't for the Vanderbilt family, because I won't even talk about a lot of the buildings they commissioned, but we'll even touch on some in this presentation, and you'll feel like I'm mentioning the Vanderbilts a lot. Full of Beaux-Arts grandeur, Marble House, as it was called in Newport, cost over $50 million in today's dollars to build. I think it came in, originally I think it was budgeted at about $3 million, and it came in at $9 million, which translates to a lot of money today. Hunt worked for many of the Vanderbilts, including George Washington Vanderbilt II, and for him, he built a chateau-esque style mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. Anybody been to the Biltmore Estate? So you know what we're talking about here. He used French Renaissance chateaux as inspirations for this, and specifically the chateau at Blois, at Chenonceau, and at Chambord, and you can see some of the architecture reflected here. Construction on this house, and it was an enormous project, required the labor of about 1,000 workers and over 60 stonemasons. And to this day, Biltmore remains the largest privately owned house in the United States. It is still owned and operated as a business, a multidimensional business, by the way, by heirs of the Vanderbilts. And then we'll just finish up on Hunt. Although this building was completed after Hunt's death, he was hired by the elite of New York to put a new face on the Metropolitan Museum of Art's building, which had just been done several decades earlier when dedicated New Yorkers came together to create this museum, but it had been built in a high Victorian style, executed in red brick and stone, and had been considered out of date almost before it was even completed. And so Hunt's new facade, which included behind it a great entrance hall, a grand staircase. I know probably everyone in this room has been in that space and gone up and down those stairs many times. But it corrected much of what an early president of the Met had termed an architectural mistake, that which it was hiding. And so Hunt's impact was broad after his time at the École des Beaux-Arts, both as a practicing architect, but also in what he had accomplished as a teacher and as a mentor in his atelier, and as I mentioned earlier, through students that attended the architecture programs at MIT and Columbia. Well, another early American student at the École des Beaux-Arts, Henry Hobson Richardson actually was the second American to go to the École des Beaux-Arts. He came home and had a classically infused, but very distinctive, and most would say an American style, one that he created, Richardsonian Romanesque, sometimes it's referred to. We're not going to talk a lot about him because most of his buildings don't really fit into my theme tonight, so we're going to very conveniently discard him and move on to Charles McKim. And McKim's story is also interesting. He entered Harvard in 1966, but really wasn't that interested in the way things were taught there. He was in the scientific school, and he instead decided to try an architectural course at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he spent 3 very productive years there from 1867 to 1870. McKim learned everything he needed to learn, and he was a perfect match for the École des Beaux-Arts because he wanted and was attracted to classical styling. He was a perfectionist. He was committed almost to his core to classical precedents. And it's been said often of McKim's projects that they are marked by a certain level of dignity. A pure form of classicism is often evident in his projects. So let's take a look at a few of them. And you know many, many of McKim's projects. He really is sort of the poster child for some of what went on in the latter part of the 19th and earliest years of the 20th century. Anybody know this building? It's on Madison Avenue. This is called the Velard Houses, designed by McKim and his partners in 1882. And what it appears as is a single, very large Italian palazzo. But the Velard Houses are actually 6 individual residences. They're right by St. Patrick's Cathedral, right by Saks. And these 6 residences are wrapped around this central courtyard in a style that is clearly from the Italian Renaissance. This building so favorably impressed his clients and all of their friends, very wealthy people that moved into these units, that McKim's firm was chosen by many other people to design buildings throughout New York, but also up and down the East Coast, including in Boston. The city of Boston was endeavoring to build a grand central public library. Libraries are just beginning to come on the scene in America. Until now, you could subscribe to a smaller library if you had the means, but most of the time, libraries weren't available to common people. That's why Andrew Carnegie, quite frankly, spent so much time and so much of his personal fortune building library systems across the United States. He had been granted access to a private library in Pittsburgh and recognized how much he gained from that, even as a poor Scottish immigrant growing up in Pittsburgh. But Boston is at the forefront. They want to create a grand public library, and they hire McKim. And this is what McKim delivers. And there's a lot of reflection of his learning in France, because for this project in Boston, McKim reaches back to his time at the École des Beaux-Arts and proposes a Renaissance-style design that was based on Henri Labrousse, Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris. And he knew Labrousse project well, both as a landmark on the Parisian campus of the École, right there on the left bank, but also likely as a place where he studied during his time at the École in that grand reading room on the 2nd floor behind those high windows. Just to give you a little bit of color perspective, what the building then looked like in Boston. And of course, the grand reading room. The grand reading room is going to emulate some of what he saw in the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, but at a much more monumental scale. This is a grand reading room, and a little bit more recent of photograph, just to give you a sense of how persistent and valuable its style really was, even to today. Well, a key part of the education at the École des Beaux-Arts was planning, both for buildings. The curriculum was really built on an approach, and the way you approached a building was figuring out what needed to be done and developing a plan for that building. And from that, the architecture was layered in. But also planning at the École was important in just general environment. And so they're teaching you planning of sites, planning of gardens, planning of parks, planning of towns, planning of cities. And when Columbia marched from its earliest days as King's College down at the lower part of Manhattan in that original colonial town of New York, it marched several times north in Manhattan. So it settled for a while in Midtown, right about where Rockefeller Center is today, and then in the early 1890s moved to a pastoral setting in Morningside Heights, which was the site of the Bloomingdale Asylum, where people went to get well. The Columbia trustees bought the Bloomingdale Asylum and decided to move their campus north, and they hired Charles McKim to develop a plan for that site. And he absolutely put together a Beaux-Arts style plan. So it's symmetrical, it's balanced, there is a sequencing, there are axes running through this plan. And you can see, and I don't know, can you see my arrow? You can see that it's all revolving around this central library. And McKim gets the project to build the library. So Seth Lowe is the president of Columbia University. He's very excited about this move. He wants to make sure the university does it right as they move to Morningside Heights. And he wants the library to be the central feature of the university. But he doesn't want what has been done before. And he has an idea that he wants not only something special, but something with a dome, something monumental. And while the trustees are sort of pushing back, particularly due to the cost of the proposed project and his scheme, he decides to help the project along by contributing some of his own wealth. So he donates $1 million in 1890. So that's worth a lot of money today. And that helps to smooth over some of the concerns of the trustees as they were worrying about how this project would be paid for. And it also allows him to give a little bit more directional guidance to Charles McKim as he's designing this building. So it's sort of a big block of a building. We'll look at the plan in a minute, and up on top, a dome. A mid-1890s project. These are two construction photos I just showed you, and of course, that's the finished project. How many people have been to Low Library at Columbia? It's an amazing space. The central reading room is immense. It takes up an overwhelmingly large percentage of the building, and then each of these little square wings that come out on the four sides house some of the offices and the stacks and various study spaces. A big critique of the building, and it happened pretty quickly, was libraries were in the business of expanding. Most universities were in the process of building their libraries. They didn't know how much space they needed to house the collection. And the problem with McKim, with Seth Lowe's plan and McKim's execution was that there was really nowhere to grow this building. So this building outlives its usefulness fairly quickly because Columbia, of course, is not going to settle for having a subpar or ineffective library with very few volumes. And so you can get a sense for just how this all worked. The stacks were on different floors, but this is the plan of the main floor, that big central reading room with desks in a circle, kind of around a central circulation desk, and then a variety of spaces around where people could either find books or go to study. He did other libraries. So we're beginning to have university libraries. We're at the very start of having public libraries, but there are still collectors who are building their own private libraries, and J.P. Morgan was one of them. And so McKim gets hired by J.P. Morgan to build a smaller library right there in Manhattan to house Morgan's personal collection. And once again, what does he do? He returns to his classical training, his classical styling from the École, and delivers a beautifully simplistic building right there. I think it's on Fifth Avenue. One of the largest projects ever assigned to McKim and his firm was the project for the main station for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So the PRR needed a station in Manhattan to compete with their big rival, and this rivalry was going on forever, the New York Central Railroad, who had built the Grand Central Depot, not yet the Grand Central Terminal, right there along Park Avenue. Alexander Cassatt is the president of the Pennsylvania when they decide to move forward with this plan. And you may recognize that name, and you're right in the recognition. Mary Cassatt did not come from a poor, struggling family. Her father was one of the most powerful individuals in America during our industrialization, and he ran the very important Pennsylvania Railroad. But what he wanted was a station in Manhattan that would serve all of their needs and allow them to compete effectively with the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the sale of passenger tickets was a very big deal. Rail transportation was important, and you could actually move yourself around the eastern portion of the United States relatively quickly on trains in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what they wanted was a station that had access, and a train line that had access to the west on the other side of the Hudson River. And so they built a tunnel under the Hudson River and knew that you couldn't cross much of Manhattan. It would be inexorbitantly expensive. And so that meant building something closer to the west side. And so Pennsylvania Station gets placed between, I think, 8th and 9th Avenue, or 7th and 8th Avenue, between 31st and 33rd Street. So it covers 2 square blocks in the city. And McKim's plan for the building is modeled a bit on the grandeur of St. Peter's Square in Rome and also the Bank of England headquarters in London. This is an enormous, enormous building. When it was completed, it was the largest indoor space in New York and one of the largest indoor spaces, indoor public spaces in the entire world. And as I think all of you know, tragically destroyed in the 1960s for the building of Madison Square Garden. And so we only have Pennsylvania Station in pictures. Although we do have a new train station in this building. But this is another building built by McKim, Mead, and White. It's built after McKim dies in 1909. So he doesn't have as much to say about it, but it's built across the street from the Pennsylvania Station. This is called Pennsylvania Terminal. It very quickly became the central and main post office in New York. And it reflects everything that had been done in the first building, but is perhaps even more refined and more subtly, I think, monumental. So that's McKim, Mead, and White, but their presence and influence will continue. A number of architects spend their earliest professional years with the firm and then go out on their own. And Carrera and Hastings are two people that fall into that category. John Carrera and Thomas Hastings, they actually meet as students at the École des Beaux-Arts in the early 1880s in Paris, and then they come back to New York after that study period and work at the firm of McKim, Mead, and White. And in many ways, that time at McKim, Mead, and White is almost sort of their finishing years, having studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. It's a logical extension of everything they had learned in Paris. And after a few years with McKim and Company, these two gentlemen decide they're ready to be out on their own, and they start their own firm. Their production, their firm's production, falls squarely in the Beaux-Arts tradition. It's a deep classical styling. A contemporary once noted this, while McKim, Mead, and White's office was known as a breeding ground for future architects. What's interesting about Carrera and Hastings is that their office often sent students to the École des Beaux-Arts. So they'd have an apprentice for a period of time, and then students would go from their office. They were big proponents of the École, and go study in Paris. And in a number of instances, the partners actually paid for the cost of their schooling in Paris. So one of their earliest projects was the Jefferson Hotel in Richmond. And the gentleman who was interested in building the Jefferson Hotel felt like if the city had a great hotel, it could begin to attract people who were interested in the arts, and maybe a production of arts and art museums would follow in its footsteps. You can see here a building that is clearly European in its influence. It's styled after the Villa Medici in Rome. But their big break, Carrera and Hastings' big break, comes in New York a few years later. There's a competition for the main branch of the New York Public Library. Again, a city trying to create some monumental public institution for the betterment of the common citizen. And as the sort of general plans for the library were formulated, William Ware, remember he had studied in Richard Morris Hunt's atelier, he was engaged, he's working at Columbia now, as an advisor to those planning for a competition. 6 finalists are chosen for the competition, so in addition to Carrera and Hastings, McKim, Mead, and White, and one of Hunt's other former students, George Post, were 3 of the 6 chosen. And McKim, Mead, and White were absolutely the front runners in this project, particularly considering that they had just recently completed the Boston Public Library. But here's where the hitch came in. Charles McKim refused to follow the prescribed floor plan that the committee had developed for the museum. And the reason why he refused to follow that plan is because he was so entrenched in the traditions and the procedures of architecture done the Beaux-Arts way. He said that the restrictive requirements essentially removed the most fundamental aspect of the Beaux-Arts design process, which he was wedded to, and that is the plan. Getting the plan together first, the architect formulating the plan, and then building the building from that point. The committee obviously has the last word, and in November of 1897, they move beyond McKim, Mead, and White and Charles McKim and select Carrera and Hastings. And they do this amazing building stretching between 5th and 6th Avenue in New York in the 40s. The building is a reflection of Renaissance classicism. It's clearly in the lineage of the White City of the 1893 World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago. And it's important to note in the whole conversation of the development of Beaux-Arts style architecture in America that the popularity of that exposition in Chicago changed the direction of American architecture. Louis Sullivan is often quoted as saying, and he was a proponent for a more American style of architecture, he's often referenced with his quote that the 1893 World's Colombian Exposition set back the development of a unique American architecture by about 40 years. And his prediction sort of came a bit true. But what you can see here is that fervor being fully embraced and accepted by the committee at the New York Public Library. And the main reading room does trace its roots back to McKim, Mead, and White's Boston Public Library, but maybe also further to Henri Lebrousse' Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève at the École in Paris, because both Carrera and Hastings had studied there as well. Well, after the success of the New York Public Library project, Andrew Carnegie provides funds to expand the system of the New York Public Library with a network of branches. And an architectural advisory committee is formed, and it consists of McKim, Carrera, and another architect, Walter Cook. And ultimately, that committee decides that they'll take the load of building these branches. They'll just split them among each of them, and so they'll have a lot of work coming through their office. And so they have a big impact in the design process and the expansion of the New York Public Library across the boroughs of New York. And this gives Carnegie an opportunity to get to know Carrera and Hastings a bit. And so by the time the commission comes for Andrew Carnegie's new Carnegie Institution, destined to grow up in Washington, it's already operating, he's founded it, and I'll quote this, to discover the exceptional man and to promote original research. That's what the Carnegie Institution is founded for by Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie gets ready to select the architect for the new headquarters, and Carrera and Hastings get the job, and you can see what they do. They deliver a monumental classicism to a very smartly sized, relatively small building. It sits there beautifully. As I was pulling pictures and images together for this presentation, one of the things I was surprised to learn was, I guess they rent this building out now for weddings. There are many, many images of recently wedded couples on the stairs, wedding parties, weddings taking place in the grand hall inside, but it's a beautiful building. Carrera and Hastings also get maybe one of the things that they wanted the most as a job, as a commission in New York, and that's to help to design some of the key components of the Manhattan Bridge, which is going to be the third suspension bridge across the East River. And they look at this as the opportunity to introduce a monumental version of Beaux-Arts architecture into that New York cityscape, something that they'd really longed to accomplish. So this is a drawing of one of the anchor piers on one of the shores. And then, of course, up at bridge level, this is the way you enter the Manhattan Bridge. So this looks like it has just been imported from either Paris or classical Rome, and has a big impact in the city of New York. And then I think this is one of the final projects from Carrera and Hastings that I'll talk about. And it's a little bit of a sad story. Although Carrera had been involved in the original designs for the amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery, there were long delays. The Macmillan plan is getting sorted out in Washington, and Washington is essentially being remade on this plan, and these grand plazas and malls and everything are being injected in much the way that Paris had been changed in the middle of the 19th century, Washington gets a bit of a makeover. So a lot of delays. They're engaged in this project from the get-go, but Carrera accidentally dies in a car accident, a carriage accident in New York City, and so isn't around to help complete this project, but he was there at the beginning of the design process. And this is the Arlington Memorial Amphitheater in Arlington National Cemetery, which is also an amazing place and just serene and melancholy as it ought to be, with all of this sort of importance emanating from the architecture. Anybody been to this amphitheater? Also an amazing. Well, you guys are very well traveled. I appreciate that. So what are the precedents for this building? Hastings cites the Greek theater of Dionysus in Athens, the Roman theater at Orange in France, as really the genetic precedents for the project, and once again asserting those classical links into the firm's aesthetic palette. The New York firm of Delano and Aldrich was formed by two architects who met as draftsmen at Carrera and Hastings' office. Delano had graduated with an architecture degree from Columbia, and he was taught by Richard Morris Hunt's student, William Ware. We've talked about William Ware quite a bit today. And both Aldrich and Delano subsequently received diplomas from the École des Beaux-Arts before opening their firm back in New York. And they practiced really in a range of styles that included a deep vocabulary of classical forms. So after he completes his studies in Paris, Delano tours Europe with one of his fellow École graduates, and in Venice he catches up with a friend from Yale, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, aboard his yacht in the Venetian harbor. And while he's visiting with Vanderbilt, he meets a gentleman named Henry Walters, who's a railroad magnate and a collector, and they strike up an amazing friendship. They are drawn to each other, and that results in Walters hiring Delano and Aldrich to create something really unique, to create a limestone palazzo behind the Walters home in Baltimore to house the family's expansive collection. This is not yet the Walters Art Gallery. This is the Walters family private art gallery. And you can see here the lineage of this building. This is absolutely descendant from some Italian palazzos, and specifically inspired as Delano is traveling around Europe. It's inspired by some of the great palazzos in Genoa. Anyone had a walking tour of some of the palazzos in downtown Genoa? I just had the opportunity to do that last year while I was traveling in Italy. Our tour guide wasn't the best, but we got the general gist of what was going on, and that was palace after palace after palace, all of these trading families right down close to the water along the Mediterranean. And this really does feel like a building that could be placed on one of those high pedestals in Genoa. It's an early project for Delano and Aldrich. It comes out probably a bit smaller than it should have come out, and McKim visits the building and makes a few comments about it as he takes a look at the plans and makes a few comments about the plans very quietly to Delano as they're putting this thing together. He sort of intimates that the stairs might be a little steep, not as relaxed as some of the stairs that McKim has put into some of his buildings. And it turns out probably the building was about a bay too short, which required them to compress those stairs. And there are a few sort of design issues that weren't exactly perfect, but it shares, of course, a lot of beautiful aesthetics. It's a start. And from there, they move on to new projects. Once again, working for a Vanderbilt, this time Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Delano designs a small pavilion on the grounds of the Whitney family's vast estate on Long Island. It's a simple building, but you can see the pure set of classical values here, right? And then the Union Club decides to finally move from the smaller building that had been designed by McKim, Mead, and White to a larger building. They buy a tract of land that's a bit larger, and they sell their Fifth Avenue location, and they hired Delano and Aldrich to design their new building. It's much larger. It's granite. It's really more a Georgian-inspired design. It has elaborate carvings. It has a very strong pattern of rustication, and so that gives the building some presence and also some classicism. Special features are everywhere in this building. They really take it to the next level, especially on the inside. There are all different sorts of ornamental ceiling rosettes and consoles around the room shaped like ships and other items, and these things are masking the air conditioning system of the building. So they're at the forefront, at the outset of moving air around in buildings for ventilation, and they're doing it in really interesting and unique ways. And then they get hired to assist in Andrew Mellon's creation of essentially a sequence of buildings to house the federal bureaucracy in Washington. So Andrew Mellon is Secretary of the Treasury under President Herbert Hoover, and he wants Central Washington. And it's really interesting because this is a very strong debate in the early 20th century in Washington. Should the American Capitol, as we begin to build it out with governmental buildings to house the bureaucracy, should it be modern and looking toward the 21st century, or should it be monumental and timeless in a certain respect and reflecting all that has come before it? And Mellon sort of wins out, and he decides that Washington is going to have a very classical flavor. And a lot of the buildings in the Federal Triangle and nearby are the result of Mellon's guidance and steering. And a number of different architects are engaged, and Delano and Aldrich were chosen to build one of the structures, which is to be the headquarters of the U.S. Post Office. What's interesting about this, so the Macmillan plan is, sort of underway. It's being shifted and twisted. And this building occupies a big block, but it also has this compression on one of the facades. It's an arched facade, and the idea originally was that there would be a circular plaza. So there would be another building built across the street with a reflective arch like this, and there would be a circular plaza there in the middle of Washington. I think what ends up getting built across the street, if I'm correct, and I may not be, is, because I'm trying to think of what street this is, I think we may be looking at some of the museums along Constitution Avenue on the mall, but I might be wrong about that. It may just be another flat building across the street. But the plan does get modified, and I'm sorry I don't have that answer fully fleshed out. And so that's sort of the story of Delano and Aldrich, or at least the story that we're going to cover today. Cass Gilbert is another early proponent of the Beaux-Arts style. He studies with William Ware at MIT, and then he travels to England, France, Italy, and he gains there a better understanding of all of the major architectural forms. So he's seeing Gothic, he's seeing Roman architecture, he's seeing Renaissance architecture and the different styles that fall in the different regions in that Renaissance period. He comes back to the United States, he joins the firm of McKim, Mead, and White, and then 2 years later, it's almost like architect after architect come and spend a 2-year apprenticeship at McKim, Mead, and White, and then they go off to establish their own practice. So it just sort of siphons people in and then spreads them and distributes them back out across America. And so we have this architecture appearing everywhere. And so he goes back to St. Paul and establishes his own practice. One writer once said about Cass Gilbert, and I love this because I think it speaks to the spirit behind everything. This writer once said that his public buildings in the Beaux-Arts style reflect the optimistic American sense that the nation was heir to Greek democracy, Roman law, and Renaissance humanism. And I think it's a really nice way of putting it. Whether or not it's true, who knows? But this, of course, sits at the lower part of Manhattan, and then the Rotunda Room inside. And you can see the Beaux-Arts styling strongly delivered by Cass Gilbert here. So the 1893 World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago is such a smash success that a lot of cities start thinking about what they might do. It's essentially the beginning of the American phase of World's Fairs, right? There had been a fair marking the sesquicentennial of the United States in Philadelphia the centennial of the United States in Philadelphia in 1876. But not much else had gone on until 1893 of substantial national note. And so other cities begin to get into the project, and St. Louis and the leaders there decide to put together an exposition dedicated to celebrating the Louisiana Purchase, which had been done by Jefferson earlier. And they're the gateway to the West, they consider themselves, so the perfect place to honor the Louisiana Purchase. And this big exposition, anybody know what the site of that exposition was? It's something very important today. It's essentially the zoo and the park and Washington University in St. Louis. A lot of the original buildings that were done there for the exposition became WashU. But one of the buildings, and I think they learned a bit from the World's Colombian Exposition that was hired out to Cass Gilbert, was the Art Museum building. All of the buildings at the World's Colombian Exposition were ephemeral. They were essentially wire and steel and plaster, and not meant to last more than a few years, and most of them burned down not long after the exposition. This building is built to stay, and it becomes the St. Louis Art Museum. But you can see Cass Gilbert there with its classical styling, and then once again here at the Chamber of Commerce building from the mid-1920s, right before the stock market crash in Washington, D.C. And so you begin to get a sense in a place like Washington, maybe more than any other place in the United States, this concentration of architectural activity, production from a number of different architects, but all following this Beaux-Arts tradition, this classical tradition, and all essentially in that same time period of the build-out. So let's talk about a few other architects, and then we'll finish up with one of my favorites. Next one we're going to talk about is Henry Hornbassel. So Hornbassel was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He trains at Columbia University, graduates there in 1891, and then he is off to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and spends 4 years there. He distinguishes himself as a superb draftsman and comes back to the United States, works in a few places, and eventually opens an office in Pittsburgh. And he's embraced there. Remember, there are a lot of industrialists spending a lot of money in Pittsburgh. Mellon is there, Andrew Carnegie is there, Henry Frick is there. There's a lot of money being spread around. That's sort of kind of the heart and soul, in many respects, of the Industrial Revolution. And he wins a lot of commissions. One of his first projects, monumentally, that he gets is Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall, built by heirs to the Grand Army of the Republic to sort of celebrate or reflect upon, is probably a better way to put it, the Civil War. Hornbassel gets engaged to develop the master plan, and of course he has his Beaux-Arts training for the Carnegie Technical Schools, which eventually evolve over the decades, and they merge with the Mellon Institute that we'll talk about in a few minutes, becomes Carnegie Mellon University. Okay, so another question. Anybody ever been to Carnegie Mellon University, the amazing campus? Just beautiful. It lays out exactly like a Beaux-Arts plan as it spreads along a couple of different axes, and beautiful quadrangles of buildings, many in a sort of refined classical style, or I should say an adapted classical style by Hornbassel, and all done in yellow brick. So it's interesting. It's not limestone, but pretty typically yellow brick. So I think Soldiers and Sailors is only partially brick. A lot of it is Indiana limestone. He also has a major project in Albany, New York. It's the New York State Education Building. Honestly, one of the most important Beaux-Arts style buildings in the entire state of New York. I'm not sure there's a colonnade in the state that's longer than this one, and there may not be a colonnade, these here, Corinthian columns, or probably more likely composites, a longer one in the United States. It's a thin building. It sits very interestingly in Albany, the state capital of New York, which later on developed a very modern architectural plan, more like what you might expect Le Corbusier to have developed. But this building sits up there and is beautiful on both the inside and the outside. And then Hornbassel does other buildings like the city-county building, which houses the county offices for Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh offices, city of Pittsburgh being the seat of Allegheny County, right there in downtown Pittsburgh. And interestingly, this building right to its left that my arrow is pointing at is Richardson's courthouse, Allegheny County Courthouse, one of his most famous buildings. So two École des Beaux-Arts trained architects having prominence right there in downtown Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I know a lot about these buildings. Another great architect also trained at the École des Beaux-Arts was Benno Janssen. Born in St. Louis, he studied at the University of Kansas, and then he goes to work in architecture in Boston, Massachusetts, and continues his studies while working at MIT. In 1902, he decides also to enroll himself in the École des Beaux-Arts, and so he goes to Paris and spends 3 years there and returns in 1905 to work in Pittsburgh for the architecture firm McClure and Spar. And then a few years later, like many of these gentlemen do, he strikes out on his own and starts a firm with Franklin Abbott. The production of this gentleman and this firm in Pittsburgh is really remarkable. So this is one of the first buildings that they do. It's the Pittsburgh Athletic Association. And honestly, this building is stunning. It was just recently restored. I think it's been turned into an office building. The PAA finally had to sell it. I think their membership was just about completely died out, and nobody was interested in joining and signing up for the upkeep that a 100-year-old building requires through the submission of monthly or annual dues. And so this thing gets turned over. It's a beautiful building, and I'm showing it here the way it's currently lit because it sparkles and shines like an absolute gem at night these days. He's modeling this building on a Venetian Renaissance palace. It's been suggested that it might have been the Palazzo Grimini, maybe Libreria, on the Piazza San Marco. And it's completed in 1911. And I'm actually showing you the short facade. I think this is Bigelow Boulevard that this facade is sitting on. But the Fifth Avenue facade that faces the University of Pittsburgh's 44-story tower at the Cathedral of Learning is about twice as long as this facade. So it's a really remarkable building with a great sight line to it. And then, like the buildings downtown, right next door, he gets hired for the design and construction of the Masonic Temple, the Scottish Rite building, which is, if you're looking at this building, it's on Fifth Avenue. Just to the left of it in this image is the Pittsburgh Athletic Association building. So you can see all of the classical styling in both of these buildings. And the forefathers of the city of Pittsburgh, their goal was to turn this area, called the Oakland section of Pittsburgh, into sort of the Acropolis of the city. And so a lot of the buildings harken back to a great amount of classicism. And just a few blocks away is this building, also by Benno Janssen. This is the Mellon Institute. This is before the Carnegie Technical Schools and Mellon Institute merged together. But Andrew Mellon and his brother had set up this place as a sequence of laboratories for research into science and technology. And what's interesting about these columns is mostly columns are built in sort of discs stacked upon each other. These are fully mined Indiana limestone marbles that were each crated in on an individual train car and then installed. So they're one-piece Indiana limestone columns. Another architect that I thought I had excluded from this presentation, and he had no formal training, but you can tell the influence, is Horace Trumbauer. This is Widener Library at Harvard University. And he's just following the flow in the United States with this trend of architecture. Someone who really built in a variety of styles was James Gamble Rogers, but he had studied École des Beaux-Arts and produced a number of works. He's probably more known for his collegiate Gothic style. Charles will know this. Memorial Quadrangle and Harkness Tower at Yale University are perhaps his best works, I think sort of broadly considered. But this is his South Hall building at Columbia. It's across the lawn from McKim's Low Library, and guess what? This was the solution to McKim's Low Library. When the library no longer worked, and there are some great photos of the librarians and students and volunteers moving the books from Low Library to this library on moving day. It's just right across, down the steps from Low Library and across the lawn. This had formerly been South Field on that Bloomingdale Asylum tract of land. I always like to show at least a couple construction photos of buildings that show the steel infrastructure being inset into basically and becoming the skeleton of the building. This is how some of these monumental buildings are accomplished, even in styles such as the Beaux-Arts or classical forms. There is an infrastructure, and then a lot of what goes on is the veneering of that infrastructure. So it's not load-bearing like the Pantheon in Rome is. These are veneers that are doing a little bit of load-bearing, but much of the load is borne by a much more modern skeletal system. So the last architect I want to talk about tonight is John Russell Pope, who just had a tremendous amount of output and probably follows a little bit more closely the rational classicism of Charles McKim than anyone else. He studied architecture at Columbia University. He graduated in 1894, and he was the first recipient of the Rome Prize to attend the newly founded American Academy in Rome. And he stayed involved with that academy until his death. He traveled for 2 years through Italy and Greece. He studied, he sketched, he even made measured drawings of a number of Romanesque and Gothic and Renaissance structures. And what's so interesting about that is that's exactly what Renaissance architects did, particularly Italian Renaissance architects, when the Renaissance was reflecting back to classical buildings from the Roman Empire. They would go out and learn about classical architecture the Vitruvian way by measuring columns and checking proportions and figuring out how classical architects in the Roman Empire had actually put together their buildings. And so here's Pope, centuries later, coming out and doing somewhat of the same activities. He was also one of the first architectural students to master the use of a large format camera. And so he begins to be able to bring back not only just sketches of buildings he sees, but glass negatives. He attends the École des Beaux-Arts in 1896, and there he hones all of this learning that he has been doing basically on his own as he travels around. And then he comes back to New York, works for a few years in the office of Bruce Price, and I bet you know what he's going to do next. He's going to strike out on his own. He works in a variety of styles. He works in the Gothic style, he works in the Georgian style, 18th century French architectural style, and also classical. But as I mentioned earlier, he's probably most remembered and most distinguished for what he had done in the classical realm. He links very tightly with Charles McKim. And he was called, and maybe this is also a reference to McKim, he's been called the last of the Romans. So here we're looking at another Scottish Rite temple, the Masonic Temple in Washington, and they put this together, and we see Pope putting into practice his beliefs about architecture. This temple is based on one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and that's the tomb of Mosulus at Heliconarsis in Turkey. And the the leader of this Masonic temple, he really wanted Pope to go all out. It's going to be in Washington, and we don't want something that has been through a discount exercise. We want something that's grand and monumental, and basically once Pope gets the contract, is given the green light to do something really, really grand, and this is what he delivers. He also gets the job for the National Archives building in Washington in the early 1930s, and builds essentially a four-sided temple-like structure that seems to have come directly from either ancient Greece or the Roman Empire, right? This is purity, much like what McKim often strived to deliver. And then once again, just taking a quick look at what it's really like under the skin, this is what that building looks like. Construction photo from September of 1933. And then I thought maybe just a color photo to give you a little bit better sense. One of the problems in using images, more recent images of buildings that were built a long time ago, is trees grow up and block everything. Right after construction is completed, you have a pure view of what the building actually looks like. You don't always get that. And so you'll notice if you study architecture or pay attention to architecture in art history books, that most of the time the photographs are taken in the winter, because if there are trees, there are no leaves on the trees. Pope's final two major projects, the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art, the building now known as the West Building, were both completed after his death in 1937, but were very much designed by John Russell Pope. The Jefferson Memorial, he had a number of different ideas for this. Some were much more rectilinear. The ultimate design that's accepted is modeled obviously on the Pantheon in Rome and stands open and grand today on a peninsula, you all know where it is, that is partially surrounded by water right there on the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. And then the other project, the National Gallery of Art, this is a conceptual drawing for the National Gallery of Art from early 1936, but he's hired by Andrew Mellon in 1935, and I don't know how many of you know the story of the National Gallery, but Andrew Mellon decides that he wants to give the gift of a national art gallery to the country. I think the best part of that story is he clandestinely, through his art dealer in Europe, negotiates with Joseph Stalin and buys a number of works as Stalin is trying to fund his 5-year plans in the evolution of socialism in the Soviet Union. He starts to liquidate some of the art treasures in the Hermitage Museum. And there is Mellon ready to buy them up. You know, Raphael's remarkable works that had been owned by Russian monarchy through the centuries. And so Mellon begins to stockpile these treasures and then offers to build the building to house them. And I always, since I'm from Pittsburgh, I always like to mention that the National Gallery, he got other people to donate their collections, other prominent industrialists. But there are 5 founding collections at the National Gallery, and 4 of them are from Pennsylvania. So really, it should be the Pennsylvania Gallery. Happens to be close to Pennsylvania Avenue, but honestly, we want our art back in Pennsylvania. We don't. We love sharing it in Washington. But this is a sketch for the National Gallery, very classical. This is what the project was looking like in July of 1937. And then, unfortunately, both Pope and Andrew Mellon die in August of 1937 within 24 hours of each other. So neither one of them sees the building completed, not the designer and not the funder. But it's, as we all will concede, an amazing place, part of an amazing museum complex in our nation's capital. So honestly, I could go on and on and on, and as I was putting this presentation together, I thought I had a different one all ready to go, and then when I reviewed it a week ago, I realized it completely missed the mark, so a new one was on order. And so I've done a lot of research and reflecting on things that I've studied before over the course of the past week. We could present so many more amazing works. Every city in the United States has a collection, a portfolio of just really remarkable buildings. And many small towns have smaller versions of that same architectural style. But we're going to stop here tonight, and just to finish our conversation, I want to reflect back to this confluence of both the beginning of this École des Beaux-Arts training for American architects, but that sort of nearly simultaneous appearance of the monumental White City in Chicago, the world's Colombian Exposition. These two enterprises drove a period of architectural production, oftentimes by École-trained artists that I mentioned earlier, lasted for more than 50 years, and in the end, put literally, as my professor at Columbia would say, thousands of classically referenced Beaux-Arts style and Renaissance style buildings across the United States, and we're the fortunate benefactors that are able to, beneficiaries that are able to enjoy those great buildings today. So thank you very much for being here tonight.